Um, yeah, I'd like to welcome all the attendees to our afternoon session. It's all three very different presentations on Sitka, and something related about Sitka. And our first one is and we'll have questions at the end. Each presenter will have a 20-minute presentation, and then we'll save questions for the end. And we'll get into how to ask your questions when we get to that point. Danielle Monteith, our first presenter, does have to leave right at 3:30. So if you have questions for him, try to get them early on in the question period. So Danielle Monteith is a professor of anthropology at the University of Alaska Southeast. He first worked in Saxman and Ketchikan, now lives in Juneau. He has been working with Alaska Native elders for over 30 years and is interested in how boarding schools have impacted their lives.
Okay. Yake Wustini, Shadnegi Anyat Kusani, Aktwasti Guganish Chish, Kiksari Shitka Kwan. I'd like to thank the organizers, and I'd like to thank the Kiksari and the Sitka Kwan people for at least on whose ancestral lands we wanted to meet today. In timing and practice, this was 21 minutes, but I'll try and cut some corners or something. When the Alaskan Society chose to have the meetings in Sitka, Alaska for 2020, I thought about what might be an appropriate topic for the conference. And after a great deal of thought, I kept coming back to one of Sitka's most prominent historical institutions, Sheldon Jackson Boarding School. And we can go to the next slide here. The course of events and discussions about racism and systemic racism in our nation this year, no doubt probably added to my interest in this topic. As an educator on the college level, a great deal of my historical research of late has been focused on historical trauma and its impact on Alaska Natives. In Juneau, I have become involved in community discussions on how we can use history to acknowledge historical trauma and how the community can begin to begin the process of healing from institutional and systemic racism. One of my most recent projects was examining how Salyek Gastineau Elementary School in Douglas was built over an Alaska Native cemetery. With that project, the perpetrator was not any one individual, but was clearly institutional racism. The challenge as an educator in the community was, how do we acknowledge this trauma and how do we begin the process of healing and even possibly beginning to bring about systemic change? In that project and in those discussions, I developed the following thoughts to kind of tell people as a preface or preamble or a postscript to the research. And here's what I wrote. The construction of the Gastineau Elementary School over Native burials is a social justice issue that provides an opportunity for education. This incident should be discussed in our community and schools, not to open old wounds or to assign blame, but rather to acknowledge a history of injustice and ensure that such treatment of Alaska Native ancestors never happens again. Respect for one's ancestors conveys respect to descendants and their cultural traditions. Sheldon Jackson Boarding School originally began as a training school for Alaska Native boys. And I feel fortunate to follow Rebecca's paper because I think it's a nice segue. Boys by Reverend John Brady in 1878. Fanny Kellogg, who was married to S. Hall Young, was one of the first teachers. It became known as Sitka Industrial and Training School. By 1889, 2 large dormitories, an industrial arts building, a blacksmith shop, a steam laundry, bakery, hospital, and 6 model cottages were built. In 1906, a boat building operation was set up and program, a boat building shop program, and Alaska Native instructor in Peter Simpson was brought on to teach boat building. In 1917, it became a high school and a boarding school. In 1944, Sheldon Jackson began operation as a college and became accredited in 1966. 2 years after the opening of the college, in 1946, Mount Edgecombe High School opened up with funds from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Sheldon Jackson Boarding School, in its many phases, was founded on the government policy of assimilation and what I would call anthropological concepts of the time period known as cultural evolutionary kind of thought. Sheldon Jackson, John Brady, S. Hall Young were some of the early Presbyterian ministers and missionaries in Southeast Alaska during the formative years of the Sheldon Jackson Boarding School. S. Hall Young's missionary philosophy, and we can go to the next slide, is clear in the following statement. And he says, we should let the old tongues with their superstition and sin die, the sooner the better, and replace these languages with that of Christian civilization and compel the natives in all our schools to talk English and English only. Thus, we would soon have an intelligent people who would be qualified to be Christian citizens. S. Hall Young, 1880. Well, this agenda clearly depicts the underpinnings of institutional racism in the boarding schools. Their disregard for the Tlingit language was upheld in the belief that Tlingit was, and in their words, inadequate to express Christian thought. Sheldon Jackson, who was appointed as the General Agent of Education for the territory, summarized the mission in Alaska to instruct a people, the greater portion of whom are uncivilized, who need to be taught sanitary regulations. And you can, I think, go to the next slide there. The laws of health, the improvement of dwellings, better methods of housekeeping, cooking, dressing, and more remunerative forms of labor, honesty, chastity, the sacredness of the marriage relation, and everything that elevates man, so that side by side with their usual drill in reading, writing, and arithmetic, there is a need for instruction for the girls in housekeeping, cooking, gardening, sewing, and mending, and for the boys in carpentry and other forms of woodworking, boot and shoemaking, and various trades of civilization. The Presbyterian, let's see, and in terms of slides, I think we can go to the next one there. The Presbyterian boarding schools were an attempt to not only cultivate Christianity, but as ethnohistorian Alice Littlefield argues, that boarding schools were designed to teach natives to become good proletariat, to show up on time, sit in their seats, fold their hands, and listen in silent obedience. And there you have the quote from Littlefield, which I'm going to let you just read as I continue. The Presbyterian boarding schools in Alaska institutionalized racism by intentionally pitting the new civilized American ways against what Brady, Jackson, and Hall termed the old or the Tlingit old customs. Kahn is nuanced and charitable in his assessment of the Presbyterian missionary perspective by stating, while negative about Indian people's traditional culture, 19th century Presbyterians were not racist. They firmly believed that deep down all human beings were the same and that any rational, responsible individual could be regenerated through Christianity. Well, all of the above material is based on primary and secondary sources, historical written sources. I would like to shift to and weave together two stories, two life histories of students who attended Sheldon Jackson. Originally, I proposed three, but I just don't have time for it. As one listens to these different stories, I would like to remind the audience of the concept of the multiplicity of voices. Rarely, if ever, is there consensus within a group, community, or culture about a subject matter. With Sheldon Jackson, each student's story is their own unique experience. The first two stories I'm going to tell, and the only ones I'll tell today, are of Tlingit women that document the historical trauma and institutional racism that occurred at Sheldon Jackson boarding school, particularly with respect to students speaking Tlingit language at the school. First, the history my first life history is about Esther Harris Shea. Harris is her maiden name, who was Tlingit and was born April 21st, 1917 in Boca de Quadra, Alaska. She was of the Cots-Hit Tequay de Tontaquan and lived in Saxman and Ketchikan, but as a child spent a great deal of her time with her family in the on the Chickaman River. As a teenager, she was sent to the Sheldon Jackson boarding school. Esther Shea says this about her experience at Sheldon Jackson boarding school. And go to the next slide with Esther and her picture, but instead of reading this, I want to play her own words that's in a video called, ethnographic video called The Bear Stands Up.
Esther and other Tlingit children were sent to government or Indian schools to be assimilated into white culture. Esther was sent away from her family to Sheldon Jackson Missionary School in Sitka.
They were very strict with us. We marched to church. We marched to go to the dining room, and then after we get through eating, we had assembly at the assembly hall. We marched there.
The joyous times of camp life with her family seemed long ago in this foreign and regimented environment. The missionary teachers forbid cultural expression, song, dance, or the speaking of Tlingit. Children caught using their language were shamed and punished.
I taught my language very good then, I spoke, because this first language I heard. And I spoke Tlingit to whoever wanted to listen to me. And I got punished for it. And I don't know, sometimes I got punished finally. I quit talking. Then I'll put up in a meditation room. They had a meditation room in our building. They had a bed in there, nothing else. And no blankets on a bed. I never forget it. I thought the end of the world would come. But I wasn't the only one that was punished for speaking the language. There was quite a few. And they were afraid to to speak it. So no, I spoke after a while.
So that's from a video called The Bear Stands Up, produced by University of Alaska Southeast Ketchikan campus. Esther said she didn't speak the language much after that. Then 40 years later, she was asked to teach the Tlingit language in the Ketchikan public schools. And later in the interview, she said, by that time, I was away from speaking my own language so much that I didn't speak it at all. I didn't want to pick it up. I knew I could speak it, but I wasn't ready to go on teaching it or to learn to read and write. So they kept on talking to me. And I finally said, okay, I'll go. Ironically, she went to Sheldon Jackson College to be trained how to teach the language and the culture. Esther taught in the Ketchikan public schools for a couple of decades and was also a Tlingit language instructor for UAS Ketchikan. And in 1994, she earned the honorary doctorate from the University of Alaska. The next Sheldon Jackson student I would like to talk about was Dorothy Denny Utterberg. She was born January 26, 1921, and raised in Saxman and Ketchikan. Her father was Henry Denny Jr., one of the last, as they say, potlatch Hitsatis of the Chokkuwu Hit Nekadi clan of the Sanya-Kwan. Her mother was May Poulson, and so she was also, both she and her mom were of the Brown Bear House of the Tekwedi clan of the Sanya-Kwan. Since her father was a prominent clan leader, she grew up speaking Tlingit. Dorothy, then as a teenager, went to Sheldon Jackson for school. She attended Sheldon Jackson a few years after Esther Shea in the 1930s. Her experience with Sheldon Jackson was somewhat similar to Esther Shea's. And after Dorothy returned from Sitka in her adult life, she did not speak Tlingit much in her adult life. The reason for that was the result of a traumatic event that happened one day in class at Sheldon Jackson. Dorothy told me about her experience at Sheldon Jackson one night after a Tlingit language class that we had had in Saxman. She told about this at a family dinner at her house. After dinner was done, she explained to her family why she did not speak the Tlingit language. She stated that she knew the language and understood it. She talked about how when she grew up, Tlingit was spoken by her mom and dad in the home. But she said that after attending Sheldon Jackson, I stopped speaking Tlingit. She said she conveyed to us a story how she was sitting in class and how one of her classmates sitting next to her had broken her pencil lead. The student sitting next to the student who had broken their pencil handed her another pencil so the student could continue working. The student who had received the gift of the sharpened pencil said to her fellow student, Gunish Chish, thank you, of course. At that point, a teacher came over to the student sitting next to Dorothy and said, what did you say? The student was dragged out of the classroom and had her mouth washed out with soap. After that event, Dorothy said it was hard for her to speak her language. She knew Tlingit, but rarely spoke it after that. I only heard of her, and this was actually my adopted Tlingit mom. I was adopted by the Tekwedi. I only heard about this experience once from her that happened at Sheldon Jackson. Raymond Fogelson, an anthropologist and ethno-historian who worked among the Cherokee, wrote about historical trauma. Fogelson, who specialized in psychological anthropology, was one of the first ethno-historians to discuss history and historical trauma. In his keynote address to the American Society for Ethnohistory, In 1988, he said and wrote, "There are events and non-events." In his work, he critically discussed the intellectual history of historians through their definitions and uses of events. This part of the paper is witty and an interesting critical analysis, but not groundbreaking. What is insightful is his construction of the term non-events and the impacts of historical trauma. Poulson writes, "The absence of indigenous peoples from documents, or what he calls non-events, are the deliberate adopting of low-profile invisibility as a defensive strategy to avoid possible discrimination, persecution, conscription, and perceived threats to their autonomy." He adds one form of non-events concerns differential recognition of what is considered an event. The example he gives of this type of non-event is whether the American Revolution was a real event for American Indians or an unmarked interval in the continuing series of struggles that had begun long before 1776 and would continue after the surrender of Yorktown. Or more critically, he questions, did the revolution for the Indians only represent the paternal substitution of George I for George III? Everyone laugh. Another type of non-event he talks about is particularly relevant to our discussion of boarding schools and involves events that actually occur and can be documented, but are so traumatic that they are denied or just not talked about. And this speaks specifically to like the Cherokee Trail of Tears. He says, as ethnohistorians, we should ask new questions, arrange new narrative plots to try and explain the native silence, if not total amnesia, surrounding these horrendous events. I
Right.
think.
Oh, sorry, Dan. So we're right at 20 minutes.
Okay.
So, I mean, I should have come in at 5 minutes before. I mean, go ahead and finish.
Yeah, I'll go right to my closing conclusion. You can move to one of the last slides there. Today, the discussion of boarding schools and its impact on Native students in Alaska is directly relevant to the discussion many school districts are having about adverse childhood experiences. When one examines recent research on adverse childhood experiences, we can begin to see the relationship between historical trauma and ACEs. Furthermore, historical trauma and ACEs transcend the generations. As a result of Esther and Dorothy's experience at Sheldon Jackson boarding schools, their children did not grow up hearing their language in the household. For their children, it has been a lifelong struggle with a range of emotions about their identity, culture, and even their mothers because of the trauma suffered at Sheldon Jackson. Then there is the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who struggle with learning the language and reconstructing their culture. Many of the grandchildren and great-grandchildren long for, wonder why, and wish for being able to learn about their identity, language, and culture the way their grandparents did. But that dish has been broken. All they can do is try and put the dish back together again as best they can. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll have some time for questions at the end. That was wonderful, Daniel. Our next presenter, Fred E. Woods. It's The Rise of the Sitka Saints, a Century of Sitka Latter-day Saint History. Fred E. Woods has worked at Brigham Young University as a professor of religious education since 1998. He has lectured extensively and internationally on the topic of global Latter-day Saints history. He has published in our Alaska History Journal, and he wrote the book Melting the Ice, A History of Latter-day Saints in Alaska. Thank you. Oh, you need to unmute. Or you need to unmute, Fred.
Thank you very much for moderating this. And thank you, Daniel. It's great to be with you today and also to be with Doug. I wanted to, first of all, just say that I really appreciate all those that have organized this conference, Rebecca, Joan, Karen, and others. Thank you so much for making this possible. So the rise of the Sitka Saints, I'm going to dive right into this. So the first visit to Sitka by Latter-day Saints was the church first presidency. This is the highest tier of ecclesiastical leadership in the church. And the LDS periodical, the Deseret News, reported their visit. I'm very grateful to the Rasmussen Library for these incredible photos going back 125 years that I was able to obtain from them. You see that this was, they're going on a journey for health and pleasure. The church president, Wilford Woodruff, was not feeling well and wanted his counselors to go with him. When they arrived at Sitka in mid-July of 1895, they noted that one of Wilford Woodruff, church president at the time, we visited the Greek church. It was a very wonderful sight. The Indians here appeared to be much more civilized than the Ute Indians, which I think is interesting as we think about Daniel's previous remarks about the Tlingit. And that in and of itself is an interesting issue. So we have here another counselor to President Woodruff, George Buchanan, talked about reaching Sitka. It's nice to be able to go into these journals and see that very day. The scenery was most picturesque. They were blown away by the beauty. And he notices here, along with this grand scenery, we returned to Sitka and remained there 4 hours, during which time we took a long tramp to Indian River, a beautiful, clear stream, and saw the falls in the river. We visited the Greek church, he notes. There were a number of old paintings here, one of the Madonna being considered very valuable. Sitka appears to be the most favorably situated for a city of any of the places which we've seen in Alaska. The harbor is most beautiful. Numerous islands, picturesque, scattered around the harbor, making scenery grander and more attractive than I have ever before witnessed. Now I want to switch ahead till 1928. Okay, we're just jumping. And here we have some Latter-day Saint missionaries. They're usually not this age, but they sent some mature men and a 20-year-old younger missionary to the area to try to decide if Alaska was really ready for the Latter-day Saint missionaries to come into the area. Fortunately, all 4 of these missionaries kept a journal, which is just fantastic. And also, I have many photos here, many from James Judd, which kind of flesh this out. And he also collected postcards. So here we see coming on the Northwestern and coming into Sitka in 1928. A brief, two of their companions explored other regions. Heber J. Meeks and James Judd visited other towns, including Sitka, on August 2nd of 1928, though their stay lasted only 5 hours. These men tried to get as much as they could out of their time scouring the area for history, but making time to place copies of the Book of Mormon. This is something you say there's hundreds of copies of the Book of Mormon throughout Alaska on this trip, and they were particularly mindful of the Native Americans, the Native Alaskans in this region. So here we have from Meek's journal, you see also the postcards along here. We visited the old Russian cathedral, St. Peter Episcopal, Bishop Rowe, the great granite stone, which tradition says if you walk around the stone 3 times and make a wish and kiss the stone, your wish will come through. Also the pioneer's home, and left a Book of Mormon in the library and also some tracts and pamphlets from the old folks to read. We also placed the Book of Mormon in the city school library, the old Russian common and the mansion on the hill, built by Baronoff. Sitka is a beautiful spot, many, many waters, and the waters are so beautiful. Judd also mentions there are many interesting as well as historical places at Sitka. He mentions the Greek Orthodox Church, Episcopal Church, Sheldon Jackson Memorial School for the natives. And he notes it's been running for half a century. Indian River Park, fine trout, totem poles, muzzle loading canyons used during the capture of Sitka from the Indians. There's also some more postcards that he gathered during this period of the 1928 trip. Now, the missionary I showed you, the young one, Lowell Plowman, that's pictured on the right here on top, he goes back to this area with another young missionary companion, Elton Maurer. And we have this 3-week intensive period here, day by day, where they're getting a real feel of what's happening at the time. So they're at the Erler Hotel, and he notes here, Plowman, there are surely a lot of Indians at Sitka. Again, today I sold a Book of Mormon for a haircut, which I find interesting. Sitka, again, you see the beauty, the most beautiful town site I've ever seen. Stirs an emotion deep in one's soul that he has never before experienced and makes him feel very humble before the great Creator. He talks again about tracting and placing 4 copies of the Book of Mormon in the business section. So here's a glimpse again from his diary dated January 14th, called on Mr. Heddleson. This is Theodore C. Heddleson, superintendent of the Pioneer Home, arranged for a meeting with the boys. They seemed, he notes, quite pleased with the program. There surely are some lovely people in Sitka. They surely treat one well. He notes the next day that a Mr. Young, a well-educated Indian at Sitka, and one to whom I sold a B of M Book of Mormon at Juneau, is convinced that the Book of Mormon is a true history of his forefathers. He believes that his people came from Jerusalem. And then tying in with Daniel, you see here on the 16th of January, 1929, this morning we visited the Sheldon Jackson School maintained by the Presbyterian Church. They have a fine school. Now shifting again, about 25 years, we had this Helen Dolick, is the first Latter-day Saint we know living in Sitka. She comes in 1947, and a decade later, there is 5 Latter-day Saint families that are meeting for Sunday school, and she's the person that is first trying to arrange these meetings and find out if there are other Latter-day Saints in the area, and her husband noted below. From the church records, and I'm very grateful for Jeff Thompson, a archivist at the Church History Library in Salt Lake City, who went the extra mile. With the archives have been closed for 7 months, but he went in and was able to send me some documents to really help me flesh out this presentation, so I'm very grateful. We see here from this record, Sitka Branch History, organized as Sitka Mount Edgecombe Branch, September 16th, 1962. So this is the first time we see an official ecclesiastical branch. A branch is the smallest unit of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, then it goes to branch, like a diocese, and a stake, like an archdiocese, where you'd have thousands of people. We also have from early records that they were actually holding Sunday school, so they're still keeping records, although there's not an official branch yet. But then it becomes a branch in 62, an official church unit. And by 63, we have an average of about 39 church members that are attending. So beginning first in local homes. There were also, it was under the direction of the mission in the area. So you had this Alaska Canadian Mission Presidency here, and this is one of their units in their region. Early evidence of early LDS meetings were held in the Alaska Native Brotherhood Hall, AKA A&B Hall. And I'm grateful to Hal Spackman and Nicole Fiorino, local Sitka historians, for fleshing this out for me. They also met at the Sitka's Women's Club, and they met at as you see here, at a rented chapel on 232 Catlin Street for several years, which was located a few houses down from one of the bars there that Doug might be talking about. By late March of '64, there was, it increased the membership to 56 members. We also know that most church meetings were held in the Sitka Masonic Hall in the early '60s. Visitors are mentioned as attending the church. Various socials were held where you'd have maybe 25 in attendance. And you see one thing in the records, the closeness of this small unit of Latter-day Saints. Sunday meetings were also held in which local members gave talks, but also played tapes from headquarters in Salt Lake City of from general authorities of the church. Helen also served as a Relief Society president. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they had a women's organization going all the way back to 1842. So here about 121 years later, they have this small group of sisters, again, meeting in homes. They covered both temporal and spiritual things. Here you have a lesson on Mark Twain, A Great American Conscience, the law of forgiveness, and various community things too, for catering for Lions Dinner and the JCs as well in the mid-'60s. So very much connected to the community, although they were a small percentage. There were also visits by general authorities to the area. One notable one was Church Apostle LeGrand Richards. Betty Briggs, someone that I've interviewed, lived there in the early '60s because her husband was hired to teach at Mount Edcombe High School. She noted she was the only one at the time that could play the piano for church meetings. Briggs recalled that they first held church on a building that had stilts, and then later rented a building for meeting that was at 232 Catlin Street, and that they had no running water in the building, so her son would get a jug of water from the local bar, which I think is Pioneer Bar, and Doug's, I was going to ask Doug, but thank you, Doug, at 212 Catlin Street. So you see this connection again with the community. And I love this quote where her husband said, who was later the church leader there, "Many times the patrons from the bar next door and the fishermen from the docks across the street would drop by during our meetings and ask us to pray for them." Saints moved into the Latter-day Saints moved to the Assembly of God church in '69, and they purchased it. But when someone from headquarters came and inspected, he said, "Look, this is not up to church standards." And so he gave the local branch president, David Rasband, the choice to either fix it up or find another location. And the decision was to find a new location. David Rasband recalled, "We decided not to spend the money for repairs, but to move out." He wrote to Church General Authority James Paramore, "The people of Sitka are eagerly anticipating building a new chapel this summer. They have made many sacrifices to purchase the land and establish a starting fund. Approximately $45,000 have been donated in the last month. Members have delayed vacations, canceled purchases, sold belongings, and donated entire savings account for their new building. People in Alaska are a do-it-yourself people. They're adventurous, industrious, and self-reliant. We want to build our own building in Sitka. We want to build it now. We anticipate the construction of this chapel to be a tremendous missionary tool," he writes to this general church leader in Utah. So the actual groundbreaking for the new building was April 6th of 1980, so 40 years ago. And you see various church leaders here involved, as well as the family. The dedication here, we let each member's family come down, pick up the shovel and dig a hole and start the construction. So this is dedicating the land first. And it really made an impact on the members because in the process of building the building, they felt like it was building themselves and the unity increased. The mission president this time was a guy by the name of Doug Snar, who was a mover and a shaker. And when they started building, it was freezing cold, nasty weather. Snar comes down, he just can't believe that they're working this kind of weather. And he says, time out. So they go in and they had a word of prayer. Snar offered it, and he asked the Lord to temper the elements, as David Rasbin said, local church leader. Anything, just temper what it is, and then it quit snowing. He writes, the clouds parted, the sun came out, water started dripping off the roof in there. A local senior missionary, Ray Sudweeks, who was sent to oversee these folks that were just volunteers, said, I've been a member of the church all my life, and I've never seen anything like what just happened.
Fred, I just 4 minutes.
4 minutes, thank you very much. So here's some images from Roy and Dorothy Sudweeks. She just passed away about a month ago. I was grateful to be able to get these photos to show the construction. You get a feel for the early things going on. Local members, men and women. Here's Amy Briggs nailing a floor, working side by side, a family affair. Womack, a convert to the area, recalled that building the Cedar Chapel was a wonderful experience, remembered how he felt God had tempered the weather during the time of construction. He also noted that a group of Tongans who were working for the Forest Service helped with the building. They couldn't get a logging permit, and so they decided, they heard about this building going on, and they jumped in. But the locals remember these are really big guys, and they had to feed them. And so it was an opportunity for growth and development, even though they were helping them. Betty remembers selling food, grilled chicken, fried bread, snow cones, cotton candy in order to raise money to build the building. In 1981, the building was complete. And at this time, there were 221 members out of a population of about 8,000. And Helen Dolick said, we grew very close together and our friendships were solid. Even the Daily Sitka Sentinel noted the news that in just 3 weeks, the walls and the roof were put in place. An average crew of 12 members worked 9 hours a day, 6 days a week to complete the walls in difficult weather. Keith Brady, the local bishop of the area, said, one of the things that surprised me when I was looking at moving to Sitka was the amount of churches that they have here. I remember the number as being 13. There's a lot of active people in their church here. It's very heartwarming. So wrapping this up, the Sitka Saints are active in church and very active in their community. There are now about 185 members now on record in Sitka. Recent community projects are cleaning up Sitka Pioneer Park and the Stargavin Campground. Epilogue, Sitka is a branch of a Latter-day Saint tree which has matured in Alaska. At the time of the creation of the Sitka branch, there was only 3,000 members in Alaska. Now Alaska has 80 Latter-day Saint church units as well as 15 family history centers to serve community with their genealogy throughout the state. The Anchorage, Alaska temple was dedicated 21 years ago. There's now about 33,495 Latter-day Saints in Alaska. Thus about 4.5% or 1 of 23 Alaskans are Latter-day Saints. Acknowledgements, the sin of ingratitude is a crime more despicable than revenge. So thanks to these good folks, and thank you again, Rebecca. That's it.
Thank you so much, Fred. Yeah, and again, we'll have questions at the end for everyone. And our third speaker for this afternoon, Doug Vandegraft. I should have asked you how to pronounce your name. as a former Alaskan, and he'll have to correct me before he starts his presentation. He is the author of A Guide to the Notorious Bars of Alaska, now in its second edition. He retired in 2018 after working 35 years as a cartographer for the federal government. Thank you, Doug.
Good afternoon. Happy to participate once again. And I'm like the rest of you, I wish I was in Sitka right now. I've been to Sitka 3 times. Every one of those 3 times was for pleasure. And I look forward to going back there again. I'm coming to you from my laptop is on top of my pool table. So not a big stretch for the author of A Guide to the Notorious Bars of Alaska to have a pool table in his house. So today I'll give a little introduction, and I'll talk about the first bars in Sitka, which in my opinion are the first bars ever in Alaska. World War II bars and the present day historic bars. So as we all know, Alaska was purchased from Russia in 1867. The US Army was assigned jurisdiction. The Alaska Act of 1868 made it illegal to import liquor. By 1873, Alaska was classified as Indian country, which meant it was illegal to give or sell alcohol to Indian or Alaska Native. The person who's violated that law was supposed to be brought to a judge within 5 days. That was tough because the nearest judge was in Oregon. It was the soldiers there at Sitka. In the 1870s, they taught local natives how to make hooch. They take a traditional beverage of bark and berries and to ferment it. It's an old picture of Sitka from 1868. You can see the Russian Orthodox chapel there on the left. That's really visible in a lot of photos that I've looked at. Not only the Russian Orthodox cathedral, but the Russian American company building there on the top of the hill. It's also visible when you look at pictures of Lincoln Street. This is not a coincidence. You know, Lincoln's, the biggest, longest street in Sitka was named Lincoln, of course, after Abraham Lincoln. In this view, you're looking towards the chapel there on the upper left. Here's a picture taken just a few years after that. A little clearer, you can see the sidewalk and the chapel. This is the view looking the other way, west as it is, towards the Russian American Company, or what was formerly the Russian American Company headquarters. The very first newspaper was the Alaska Times, and it was published in Sitka. And even though it was illegal to have liquor, there were definitely bars in Sitka. And the newspaper allowed them to advertise. And so these are the first bars that I have documentation for that were in Alaska. The Sitka Saloon, of course, also called the Collar and Elbow, the Corner and Elbow. And Sam Milichek was the saloon keeper. Says his billiard tables are the latest style, and his liquor and cigars are not surpassed anywhere. Kaplan and Company was also on Lincoln Street. Mr. Arthur Bard is always ready to wait on his customers. G.W. Brady's Billiard Saloon, also on Lincoln Street. Drinks were 12.5 cents. That's 1 bit, 25 cents being a bit. There's the one-bed house where you have to pay twice as much than the other previous place. And this place, run by Edmund Jones, has liquor, cigars, and apples always on hand. Apples always good with your liquor. Sitka Brewery. I look at this advertisement, it makes me think you can probably get a beer there too. The Central Saloon, a man named John Peterson, and I think he either changed the name of his saloon or moved it, because a year later, he had a different saloon, the Petersburg Saloon. And this was before the town of Petersburg existed. And this is on Grant Street. And I could not find any other evidence of a Grant Street anymore in Petersburg. So after that, after 1869, Army troops left Sitka in 1877. The Navy arrived in 1879, and they stayed until 1912. By 1899, Congress had figured out that it was just too hard to enforce the anti-liquor laws in Alaska, and so liquor became legal in 1899. 1906, the capital of the District of Alaska moved from Sitka to Juneau. 1912, Alaska became a territory. 1913, women were allowed to vote. This gave a lot of weight and influence to the temperance movement. And that meant that by 1918, Prohibition again took over Alaska. That was a whole 2 years before the rest of the United States. And I've done my research for, of course, the book, but when I do these talks for a particular town, I consult the Sanborn fire insurance maps. And there are 3 of them for the town of Sitka dated 1914. And usually I'm able to, like for Juneau or any of the other southeast towns, Nome, I can find bars. They list saloons on the maps, and there are no saloons shown at all in Sitka. And that was interesting to me. I bring that up just because it was kind of an anomaly there. As I said, 1933, liquor, alcohol became legal again. First, just beer and wine. And by 1938, the United States Navy returned to Sitka, and the seaplane base was constructed on Japonski Island, adjacent to town. It would be until 1972 before they'd actually build a bridge between the 2 islands. But I'm bringing up the point about the Sanborn map and lack of saloons to make a point, is that Sitka is not Juneau, and it's definitely not Anchorage, it's not Fairbanks, and it's certainly not Nome. This place is not known for a lot of wild and crazy bars, or even a multitude of bars. When the statehood happened, it didn't get a whole bunch of new bars like Fairbanks and Anchorage did. And when the pipeline was built, also had no effect on the number of bars in Sitka. And so I think they enjoyed that reputation. 1941, Army arrives in Sitka, establishes 2 forts in garrisons just outside of the city. Again, not a whole lot of soldiers. There are more soldiers, but not near the influx that they had in Anchorage. I ran across this article. This is an editorial by the editor for the Sitka Sentinel, calls it Sinful Sitka. And he saw there was an article in Newsweek titled Lutherans Invade Sinful Sitka, a magazine of national circulation, which everyone in Sitka should read. It gives the impression that Sitka hasn't any religion. In this issue of the Sentinel, there are 6 church notices. The second paragraph states, a long street lined with saloons, gambling dens, and brothels that did a lusty business. And he counters, says, look at that street the next time you're on it. You will find that we have just 2 places where spirituous liquors are sold by the drink, and that there are but 5 places with wine and beer licenses. What town or city in the States can boast a population half as large as Sitka that hasn't more drinking establishments? Gambling dens here consist of card rooms, 3. And if they are dens of iniquity, then what of the hotel room gambling in the States? Brothels that did a lusty business. We know that if a girl or woman was accosted on the streets of Sitka, all hell would descend upon him, and there is no soliciting on our streets. But there are bars that were established in the World War II era that people still talk about, that when the newspaper finally started publication again in 1939, that is the Sentinel, there were bars that advertised in the paper. This one is called the Silver Foam, and it was run by a man named Walt Bacon. He actually called it the Silver Foam Recreation Parlor. You can see the building here on the left, that's the Silver Foam, and at the very bottom there it says Walt's Place. Walt didn't own it for very long. In 1941, he passed away suddenly in California. Here's some Navy guys out front of the Silver Foam. As I said, we'll call it the Recreation Center, the Silver Foam Recreation Center. And this was unique to me, you know, in that a cocktail bar, you can also get probably an ice cream sundae, or at least an ice cream cone. In my experience in Alaska, I haven't seen many bars where you can do that. Join the fun, cocktail bar, ice cream, and there was gambling too. So did very well during the war. Mr. Harry Haugen was the manager back then in 1943. He liked to advertise. Here's an advertisement for 1947 for the cocktail bar. It was right after that that he closed it for a while, and he did a whole remodel, and he made it look like a boat, like a bow of a ship, and he had an anchor in there and a ship's wheel and everything. But it didn't last very long, unfortunately. It closed in 1952, and it is now Old Harbor Books. That is the building where the Silver Foam used to be. Here's the Anchor Bar in 1940. More soldiers out there waiting to get in or having a smoke outside. They were also a very patriotic bar. They encouraged people to come to the Anchor Bar and donate a book so they can get them to the soldiers. Also a good place to watch the World Series of 1943. Unfortunately, like many bars in Alaska and other places too, a fire in 1956 just wiped it out, and it was never rebuilt. Columbia Bar. I can prove that it was open in 1940. It might have been open earlier than that. Again, the paper started up again in 1939. It's hard to document exactly when a bar opened. Here's some Navy guys in front of the bar. Here another picture of them. Dave and Margaret Fenton, who owned the bar, they like to advertise. I thought this was amusing. The dancing advertisement. Take her where she wants to go. Always the finest orchestras at the Columbia Cocktail Bar. And, you know, the word orchestra, that probably pretty much a liberal term here. We probably have somebody on the piano, maybe a singer, maybe someone with a saxophone. I have trouble envisioning a full orchestra at the Columbia Bar. A general named Arnie Dorham owned it for a while. He liked to advertise in the Sitka telephone directory. These are all advertisements during the 1950s for that bar. Patrick and Loretta Ness bought the bar in 1976 and had it for many years. And Patrick passed away in 2002. And this is something else that happens that I've noticed in the course of my research. If it's a couple that owns the bar and one of them dies, it seems like it's not very much longer that they look for a way out of the business. It's just not the same anymore. And so that indeed happened. They sold the bar just a year after this happened, after Patrick died. And it became a liquor store in 2004. I don't know if it's actually still in operation, but the building is still there. And Robert DeArmond, who's written lots of books about Sitka, identified it as the oldest frame building in Sitka. Ernie's. We know about Ernie's. I can definitely prove that this was opened in 1941. Ernie Carter was from Washington State, and the 1940 census had him in Juneau working as a bartender. He was, according to the census, married to a woman who called herself Jean. Her marriage license is until 1947. But he decided to move to Sitka, and he was a manager at the Silver Foam in 1941 and decided to open his own place. And coincidentally, he opened the bar. The opening night was October 16th in 1941. So that's 79 years ago tomorrow. That's Ernie in the middle there. He was rarely ever seen without wearing a suit.
And Doug, it's 5 minutes.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
And he liked to advertise too. They called him debonair in this photo. He was charged with disorderly conduct and charged $100 in 1949. And 1 year later, he and his wife were getting divorced. And the wife the judge awarded the wife custody of the bar. And Ernie left town in 1950 and never came back. And I looked it up. He went to Oregon and got married again, became a truck driver. But it's interesting to me that after all these years, and Ernie's been gone since 1950, that we still have a bar in Sitka named after Ernie. Stan Filler, who became an owner in Ernie's, and he was elected mayor in 1997. I think he's still a part owner of the bar. It's a really nice place. Has some good booths and pool tables. And this thing, whatever it is, the Side Hill salmon, which looks like it's half salmon and half deer. If I go there next year, I will make sure that they change the mirror. It's been since 1941, not 1939. Art's Place, I thought this was interesting. Art opened the place in 1944. 2 years later, he was dead. Here's his obituary. He was found dead in bed. He was born in Balden, that's near Germany. He was between 84 and 86 years of age. He was a gold chemist for Tiffany Jewelers in New York City, came to Alaska over 50 years ago. He was a U.S. Marshal at Cordova and a mayor of Valdez for several years. So here he is at the end of his life, has a bar for 2 years and then dies. That's too bad. This guy, Howard Bradshaw, everyone called him Brad. He and his wife took over, called it Art's Place. And then, unfortunately, they got in trouble. They were caught selling quart of whiskey to a student from Edgecombe Vocation School who was 18 years old. I didn't ever actually find out what happened, but less than a year later, they sold out to Roy Heron and Harry Thorburn, who changed the name to the Pioneer Bar, which is what we have today, 1952. Pioneer Bar, little shorter in atmosphere, but long on booze and beer. Lots of things have happened here. Here's some highlights. There was a robbery there, and the robbers actually escaped in a hijacked plane. They have sponsored a thing as part of Alaska Day, what they used to call a slave auction. But in 2015, there was a lot of people that did not like the word slave auction, so it's now the Alaska Day auction. It's just people loaning themselves out for a price for charity to do odd jobs and things around town. But it made national news. Here's the inside of the Pioneer. Also, lots of cool photos from bygone days. Here's the ship's bell, the bar bell now. And these guys apparently shaved their heads for a good cause. I think one of their friends had cancer or something. And this one decided he'd like to have I think he's either getting his back shaved or he's getting a tattoo right there in the bar. I'm not quite sure. This is my website. And of course I have an email address. And again, I look forward to seeing everyone in person again and visiting the Pioneer, of course, and Ernie's Bar.
Thank you so much, Doug. And I haven't done this part before with the questions, but if you are watching this and you have a question, we have, and we'll try to take questions for Daniel first because he's got to leave right at 3:30. But you can raise your hand. There's a raise your hand button on your Zoom screen if you're a participant. And you can also question. You can type a question into the Q&A.
So Rebecca, there have been some people who have already typed some questions in the Q&A and addressed them to certain people. And Fred has already answered the ones that were directed to him. And so participants should be able to see all the questions typed in and answered, but I don't know if you want to read them out. But there is a question, couple questions for Dan. Ron Inouye asks Dan, Was Sitka in Alaska part of a general Presbyterian effort to work with indigenous groups around the US? Was it to provide education or proselytization?
Yeah, good question. Was there a national effort? Yeah, I believe so. I don't know for sure on that one, Ron. It was a blended message of um, uh, they were really trying to change them in terms of culture, language, education, and missionization. The third person I wanted to talk about was actually a guy I knew back in the 70s who was Dr. Reverend Henry Fawcett, who was, he grew up in Metlakatla, and he had actually been, so a little different story, one person who had a very positive experience at Sheldon Jackson, and he went on to become Presbyterian minister. He went a little bit later. He was born in 32, and he was one of the first graduating classes from Sheldon Jackson once it really became a formal community college. I'm not sure that answered your question, Ron, but I haven't done as much work on the Presbyterian missionary efforts in the lower 48, but I believe it was fairly uniform. Someone else asked a question, and help me out, Rebecca. It was about other groups that might have been bilingual. What was the question there on that?
So the question is, Dan, were there any non-Orthodox religious organizations that promoted bilingualism in the late 19th or early 20th centuries?
Right, good question. And this one, of course, Michael Krauss, Richard and Nora Downhauer, and Sergei Kahn talk about how the Russian Orthodox priests really tried to be bilingual and translate so many things from the Russian to the different native languages and learn it. There was one other church that I can think of, and folks could correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember when I was working up in Bristol Bay, I read a piece maybe published by the Moravian Church that talked about the Moravians early on anyway, tried to translate things a lot into Yupik and tried to learn Yupik. So the Moravians, and there were efforts, Constant Nash and I'm looking for their names, and Story and Nash were two people who I believe were part of the Presbyterian Church, and they were the ones that helped come up with the Tlingit verb dictionary. There were some folks who did some work with the Tlingit language, but the early efforts were very monolingual in focus, both politically and otherwise. And, pretty detrimental in their comments about civilized, uncivilized, and Tlingit language lacking in terms of being able to communicate Christian values. Regrettable. In the Presbyterian Church, of course, in the early 90s, when I first started working in Southeast, I remember they actually did a formal apology at the Grand Camp Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood. So, they've tried to do things to apologize and mend and heal some of those things.
Thank you.
Yeah, Carol Gales, who's in the audience, added a comment in response to that Father La Fortune, who worked with the King Islanders, translated English hymns into Inupiaq and could speak the language. She's not sure if other Catholic priests did anything similar. So just was another response.
Yeah, I think there were probably obviously pockets. There were several Alaskan natives who were recruited as teachers and ministers working with the Presbyterian Church and the Presbyterian schools. And some of them, quietly, you can read different things from the Dowenhauers and others where they quietly would still speak the language in classes. That was true in Juneau. I'm forgetting the Alaskan Native teacher that would speak to the students in Tlingit. So it wasn't universal, and that's why I brought up the concept of the multiplicity of voices. It's the policies and the institutional racism was there, but there were a lot of people who compassionate, kind, and that.
So we have a question for Doug. In the early days, was all the alcohol shipped to Alaska, or was any of it brewed or distilled in Alaska?
A lot of it came from Canada. Canada didn't have could you read the question one more time?
Whether in the early days, if it was all shipped here, or was any of it brewed or distilled in Alaska?
Well, yeah, that's right. The point I was making in the early days, meaning like in the early days of Sitka, a lot of it just came in through ships. The Alaska Russian company, Russian American company, traded willingly with the natives and had alcohol and would trade with them for a bunch of different things. Yes, it was a lot brought in just by ships. And it was the soldiers who taught some of the natives of Southeast Alaska to make their own, just that hooch word came from a little village called Hoochinoo, which is near Angoon. And those natives who lived there became particularly adept at making it. And so the word hooch, which is still used today, is Alaska's contribution to the American vernacular.
I don't know if we want to review the questions that were asked to Fred and what your responses were, if we have time.
That's fine, or if they come up again here, I'm not seeing it.
Look in the answered column.
Okay, I'm looking in the answered column. Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, so this is from Ronald. He said, was the book translated in native languages as has the Institute of Summer of Linguistic? What are the diaries you mentioned? Are records from the local churches and stakes kept locally? And I answered this privately, but I should have done it, buddy. So first of all, the Book of Mormon has been translated in 110 languages since 1830 when it first came out. Where are the diaries? Church History Library, meaning the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City. Just a plug for that, even if you're not a Latter-day Saint, what an archive for thousands and thousands and thousands of primary sources for academics. So anyway, because they felt under a religious obligation to record their lives, they still do. So it is a very, very rich source. Our records from local churches and stakes kept in Salt Lake City, yeah, they're kept and then sent to Salt Lake City. So that was the question there. And then Joe had the question. She notes, it's unclear to me whether the early Latter-day Saint officials traveled to Sitka for vacation missionary work. It was just that early 1895 group. That's very unusual. And then later, assistant historian that went, Andrew Jensen, 1927. But he also did a little bit of work along the way, which set things in motion for 1928. Then it was, if the latter, what made Sitka ripe for Latter-day Saint mission efforts for natives primarily targeted by conversion or everyone? Everybody was targeted. They paid their own way to go, and they just placed a lot of copies of the Book of Mormon wherever they could. And I actually found one in the library at UA in Alaska, dated to 1928, with one of the names of those missionaries. And I'd been looking for one, so I was very excited to actually find one. And so I'm looking here. I think that's it for me, but thank you for the questions. And thank you, Joe, for mentioning that.
And we can also, was there a new question? There's another question for Doug. A lot of military expeditions allotted alcohol. Did the early Army, Navy, Coast Guard do so here? When Alaska military bases were established, which ones had the earliest bars?
So the first question was like whether the military allotted alcohol to the soldiers. I actually don't know that. There were, in other bases in Alaska, there would be an officer's lounge and things like that. So but no, I don't know the answer to that first question. And the second question was?
When Alaska military bases were established, which had the earliest bars? So I'm assuming that's World War II era.
World War II, I don't know the answer to that one either. Sorry.
Something more for you to research.
I can chime in on the alcohol question. And I remember looking at a lot of the original documents for Fort Tongass down on Tongass Island. And I want to say that there was a basic ration, maybe just for the officers, but one of the comments in some of the early documents, and that fort only stayed open for about a year and a half, and they shut it down. But some of the communications talk about too much drinking and just kind of the men and the health conditions and all kinds of things. So I think they were getting, alcohol from different, kind of forest operations, so to speak, distilleries and other things. Juneau in Douglas over here, we had some of the first brewed beer. There was, I'm seeing over here in Douglas, and there was Dibco, Douglas Island Brewing Company.
Yeah.
And
well, you saw in the presentation, there was a Sitka brewery in 1869, so they had beer, obviously.
Yeah.
But a lot of the harder alcohol, rum and brandy, came in via ships to Sitka and was traded with the natives for different things.
Maybe I could just go back to Rebecca. Just one thing, I'm looking back at Ronald's question. I mentioned there was 110 translations of the Book of Mormon, but he specifically asked what he translated into native languages. Yes, many native languages, but none that I know of as far as Alaskan native languages. So I wanted to clarify that. And just a quick comment earlier with what Daniel was asked the question about the Presbyterian Church. Just from my experience and studies, the Presbyterians and other Protestants used education as a means for conversion, but that was the bottom line. It was definitely conversion to Christianity. And I know Presbyterians also came into Utah and offered education in places like Salt Lake City because they wanted to convert the Latter-day Saints to the Presbyterian faith. So good intentions wanting to do that, but it was clearly education was the means to the end.
Yeah. And they actually, the Presbyterian, in my research with Saxman and Ketchikan and the Sunyaquan and Tontaquan, the Tongass and Cape Fox people moving from down around Tongass Island, the Presbyterian Church kind of dangled in front of them medical hospitals, and we were about to head towards, yet another round of smallpox. And so the Cape Fox and Tongass people were pretty interested in smallpox vaccines. And the missionization effort said, we will give you vaccines and set up a hospital or a clinic along with churches and a school. So it was kind of, that came in there as another carrot to kind of, in terms of the missionization effort. And that wasn't, it was a lot of the different Protestant churches, because in Ketchikan you had the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians, I think, early on.
We have a couple more questions. I'm not seeing one. It disappeared now. But here's one I do see now. To Doug and Fred, was there any conflict between LDS members and the establishments that Doug profiled? Did religious groups oppose the growth of bars in Sitka?
Fred, I don't know.
I would say no. I mentioned specifically with the Pioneer Bar that Doug did a great job talking about. They were grateful to get water. I don't think so. I think it just wasn't that way. Don't see a thread of evidence at all. And that, although you probably already know Latter-day Saints Mormons don't drink, but that was not an issue that I can find anywhere.
It didn't come up in my research either.
Rebecca, I think the thing that might have disappeared was there was a response from Shauna about Fort Kenai records from 1969. 1969 or 1869. But alcohol was a very big deal and the hot commodity at the Fort Commissary. It's just a response about the military and alcohol.
Rachel Myron has a question about potatoes and potato production and distilling. One of my students, Elizabeth Kanibe, did a lot of the research on potatoes, and I think more of a factor in alcohol, particularly hard liquor, was molasses. That was a huge, a lot of the stuff I've read and some of the documents, they were really trying to control for molasses coming in. I'm not so sure. Probably they were doing stuff with potatoes.
Raisins, molasses and raisins.
Yeah.
Combo.
And molasses, even though Alaska was dry, they couldn't prohibit molasses from coming in. And so it did.
Yeah. But potatoes might be a good one, particularly Admiralty Island. Rachel, from an archaeological standpoint, lots of kind of potato mounds there on Admiralty, and that's what Doug was talking about, some of the hidden distilleries there. Who knows?
And here is a from Ruth Natman. It says, not a question, but a comment. My good friend Mary Jane Evans' fate and sister were sent to Mount Edgecombe, 1948, 49, 50, 51. She wanted to go to college, but was told she was only an Indian and could not go to college. A boy, so-and-so, was a good boy. She should marry him and have babies. Of course, she became a leader of American Indian women. So that's a little story.
Yeah.
Of what a woman learned from Mount Edgecombe, not what she was supposed to learn.
Yeah.
And Shanna corrected it was 1869 for Fort Kenai, as I thought.
And my impression was starting in 1939 when the contractors came in for the military, I think a lot of the drinking and prostitution establishments were underground. They were like outside the city limits.
That would be consistent with other Alaska towns. I was talking about that last year in Kodiak. They had the hill, as they call it, where the girls were, and there were bars in town where the enlisted men, 8 o'clock, 8:30, everything had to shut down. So they just went out of town to the bars that were outside the city limits and continued to enjoy themselves.
Wow. So we're doing good. I think we're, if there aren't more questions, and I'm pretty sure there'll be a way, because I know the entire conference is being recorded and it will be made available on the Alaska Historical Society site. And I'm assuming there's a way that, somebody's interested in following up with any of the presenters, that there'll be a way to contact them. Is that right?
It's a good question. I don't know. It might be best that people just send it to members at alaskahistoricalsociety.org, and then we could forward them from there so that everybody's emails aren't put out on a public website. People might not be comfortable with that. But the recordings are being done session by session. So people can just watch and listen to one session at a time, whatever interests them. And I'm not exactly sure when they're going to be on the AHS website or exactly how, but I will be sending out an email to all the registrants when it's up and running and we have that all figured out. And then, there it's open to the public, it's free to view, you can tell your friends about it, whatever. There's no registration fee or anything.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. And I think that is one thing that that we're getting from this conference, as in a real one, is that I think there's a lot of, ideas being generated and interesting topics that are coming up and avenues to pursue. And thank you, everyone.
And I just want to give the pitch for tomorrow. Remind everybody that we're back here tomorrow, 10 a.m. And we'll have a great session on the history of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And then in the afternoon is a panel and discussion about monuments and history in the public square, moderated by Ian Hartman, and panelists will start the discussion, and then it will be open for other people to share their thoughts on that. So interesting, should be a lively day tomorrow. So hopefully we'll see everybody then. And now we can go to Doug's virtual bars.
Right, right. The kitchen.
Ernie's, the bar I talked about tonight. If you go to their website, there's a virtual bartender who will talk to you, and it's just a tape that just plays over. He asks you how things are going at home, and how the kids doing and stuff like that. It's sort of funny, kind of sad at the same time, But if you want to talk to a bartender, you can go to Ernie's and talk to a bartender.
All right.
Thanks to everyone. Thanks, organizers, panelists.
Enjoyed being with you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
And